So imagine, you're walking down a canyon. You're coming along the ridges, up and down, over the ledges, over boulders, down escarpments, kind of skidding. It's really, really hot out. You're sweating. You come around a corner and you find in a large alcove, there's a kiva, shoved off in one corner, with a couple little storage rooms next to it. Nothing else really, a little midden. And you're looking at it and you examine it for a while, and all of a sudden, slowly, you realize, well, there's really no good water source nearby. Not reliably. There's no farming here. There's no big habitation in this canyon. There's no big habitation contemporaneous with it on top. So, what was somebody doing here? Why are they here? And why is this kiva shoved back in a corner, not centrally located in the alcove? Why here? So that's the question that my colleague, Jim Crable, sitting over here, began to ask in 2007 at a site like this. He was on Cedar Mesa, southeast Utah, and he'd been to lots of sites, Cedar Mesa, Comb Ridge, all up into Ruin Park, down toward the San Juan River, over Montezuma Creek, almost to Colorado, all the way over in Lake Canyon. He'd been all over, and he kept seeing these kivas that were out there by themselves. And so out of this question, why here, he started the Archaeoastronomy Survey of Southeast Utah. Just the two of us, looking at these kivas. And since 2008, we've been to 203 sites, mostly canyon sites, some on the mesa tops in southeast Utah. And what we do, we go to these sites, we take a small Mountaineers Transit, about 8 pounds, we set it up on a tripod. It measures the azimuth and altitude to 1 arc minute. For reference, the sun and moon are both 30 arc minutes across, so you can get a very good sense of the edge of the moon, the edge of the sun from these measurements. And we look at the landscape around these sites. So it's not just an architectural site sitting out there. They built it within a landscape, and they looked out at the landscape around them. And so we look at that landscape, we survey it with our instrument, and we map based on the kivas from each kiva in the site, because some of these are larger sites, some of them don't even have kivas. We consider all kinds of sites. We look at each kiva, we look at sit stones, we look at rock art, and we survey from the different locations within the alcove or other site. And because the sites are in canyons, the landscape is very close. It's near field. And so if you move from one end of an alcove to the other, or even just a couple meters inside the alcove, the viewpoint changes considerably. Okay, and so we map the landscape from each of the important locations in the site, and then we compare those maps with prehistoric paths of the sun and moon. So we look at the winter solstice, summer solstice, and equinox, the winter and summer cross quarters, which are halfway between the equinox and solstice, and then also for the moon, we look at the major and minor standstills in the north and south. So we have all of those, and we compare from Jet Propulsion Laboratories, we compare all that data with the maps of these landscapes. What we found, today I just want to talk about the kivas and the kiva positions that we've discovered. So we've surveyed, so far, 95 kivas. And of those 95 kivas, 42%, that is 40 kivas, appear to be aligned with these astronomical events. So what that means is that the kiva position is very specifically located so that there are anomalies on the landscape that match with the sun or moon during these events. So an anomaly might be a place where two canyon rims meet, forming a corner, or some other shape. It might be a boulder sitting up on the rim. It might be a hoodoo sitting out there. So those are the kind of features we map and compare. And so if you have a kiva and one of these features, one of these anomalies, and then one of these events, the winter solstice, say, and you have all of those in a line, then we say there's an alignment. And so 40 of these sites have alignments. 23 of those have one alignment. Among those, 9 are winter solstice, 4 are equinox, 2 are summer solstice, 1 is winter cross quarter, 1 is summer cross quarter, 2 are south major standstill, 2 are south minor standstill, and 2 are cardinal south. So definitely an emphasis on winter ceremonies and fall and spring. And that matches perfectly well with ethnography, where a lot of the ceremonies, a lot of things happening in kivas happen during the winter. So out of that, okay, so you might say, well, it's just one alignment. That could be just a coincidence, right? And in some cases, that may be the case. But we also have sites like the 11-meter kiva sitting in the bottom of a canyon. And there's very little on the landscape around it. But sitting on the rim, just below the cap rock, there's a huge boulder, huge thing. And right below it, there's a corner, a V shape. And out of that corner, the equinox sun rises. And so the religious experience at that kiva would be remarkable, because the center of the kiva is connected with that landscape and with the skyscape. Okay? So some of them may be coincidence, but some of them clearly are not. In addition to the single alignments, we have 5 kivas that have 2 alignments, and 12 kivas that have 3 or more alignments. Okay, out of those, 14 are winter solstice, 12 are equinox, 8 are winter cross quarter, 2 are summer cross quarter, 6 are south major standstill, 5 are south minor standstill, 1 is summer solstice, and 1 is cardinal south. So again, we see this kind of strong emphasis on winter, strong emphasis on equinox. We see a little more coming in with the lunar. Generally, you would have 2 solar and then 1 lunar associated with it, and very, very few during the summer. When you have these multiple alignments happening with the kiva, what it means is that the kiva can only be placed in one location. So it very specifically, if you have the shape of the alcove plus 2 or 3 other dimensions dictated by these alignments, you can't put the kiva anywhere else to have those features functioning, right? Okay, so some examples. One is on Comb Ridge, and there's a large alcove, lots of stuff going on. Not one of these isolated kivas, but a kiva in a large habitation site with lots of rock art, lots of stuff going on, but really only one kiva. And so we looked at this kiva, and there's only 5 anomalies on the landscape. So 5 of these little corners or boulders and such. And out of those, 3 of the 5 match up with the winter solstice, summer solstice, and equinox. So what we can infer from that is that they were probably there throughout the year. You know, they were hanging out using this kiva for many different seasons. Versus the one in the equinox, with only the equinox alignment, we could say, well, they were just there during the equinox. And out of that, you can say, well, if they're just there during the equinox, then who would be using it during the equinox? If you look at ethnography, you can even say, well, maybe it was the women's societies. And if rock art and other features are corroborating that, then we learn a lot just by looking at the landscape and the skyscape around these sites. Okay. On the other hand, we have sites that, remember, these are in the canyons. You're looking at near field, really close up features that shift. Remember, with where you are in the alcove. But we also are looking at these mesa top sites where you're looking across long distances at other features. And if you're looking across a long distance, it doesn't matter where you are in the site. You could be at a kiva, you could be at a rock art panel. We can't determine what specifically was intended as the marker. You know, we can't pinpoint. One of those is sitting on the edge of a canyon, looking off at Sleeping Ute Mountain, miles and miles away. You know, we're not even in Colorado. But this site has a few kivas, some rock art, all kinds of stuff happening. And this site, it looks out, and at the north end of Sleeping Ute, you have your winter cross quarter, right at the base of the head, I guess. And at the toe, you have your south major standstill. And in between, you have your high point marking the minor standstill, and you have your winter solstice marked by another point. So you have this perfect calendar set up with Sleeping Ute Mountain from this site. And while we can't say, well, it's this one kiva, we can certainly say that site seems to have an astronomical bent to it. And definitely winter, you know. They were there in the winter, kind of hanging out. It was an important place because of that. We have 7 of those sites where where we seem to have things happening, but we can't figure out what exactly it may have been. Okay, so if you have these multiple alignments happening, people often ask us, well, if you have all these alignments happening throughout the year, and you have major and minor standstills, which take 9 years from minor to major, and 18 years from major to major or minor to minor, how can you expect the pueblos to have been hanging out in one place waiting for an entire year? I mean, that doesn't make sense. And then you get it wrong and you have to do it all over the next year. It just doesn't make sense. It's impractical. Right? So how could they have done it? And they come up with that as a problem. Like, they couldn't have done this, so it can't be real. But Jim has what he calls the cheat sheet. And the cheat sheet is the stars. Because the path of the winter solstice sun, the path of the minor standstill moon, all of those could be matched up with stars. They still can be today. They had their stars very likely in prehistory. And if they watched the path of that star, it would perfectly follow the path of the winter solstice sun. Okay? And those would change over time based on precession. A gradual change in the position of the stars. But for a century or two, they would work, and then they would have to figure them out again. So like in the 900s, the bright star Antares in Scorpio would work for the winter solstice. But by the 1100s, no more. It's the next star up. You know, they kind of have to shift things. You would have Sirius, the bright dog star, for the minor standstill. For centuries it functioned. You had Arcturus for the summer solstice. And we even have, at one site, we have a pictograph, or a petroglyph, some, like 5 little bitty pecked basins that are drawn out like stars. And they perfectly map Sagittarius. I said, wow, that's kind of weird. And then we realized there's a big Oya basin right in the middle. And that Oya basin is exactly where the major standstill moon would have stood in that constellation. So if they had seen the moon in that position with Sagittarius, they would have known exactly which stars to use. And we see that in rock art, just drawn out perfectly well in southeast Utah. Okay, so then finally I want to talk about the 55 kivas that don't have alignments. Okay? You say, what about those? All right, so those 55 kivas, at 39 of those sites, there's either another kiva or some other feature that has a calendar that has these alignments happening. So in those cases, it's possible, it's still likely that the kiva is ceremonial and being used for, being used during these astronomically determined dates and ceremonies. But in some cases, the observer, the viewer, can't be on the kiva. The observation itself, and we've talked with Hopis and other people about this, and the observer simply can't be in a public place. They have to be separated. So we find that there are observation points away from the kiva, and that's happening in a lot of different places. And so, a lot of these kivas where there's not something happening at the kiva, it's happening away from it. In other cases, the kiva simply spatially can't be placed in the ideal location. So the alcove just isn't big enough in that place, or the stone is too hard, you can't put it there. And so one of these is looking out over a broad valley. Okay, a broad valley, and there's one hoodoo out there across the valley, and it's a small alcove, and there's a square room sitting at one end of the alcove. And there's a kiva down in the dirt below, but the kiva couldn't be placed in the alcove. And that room looks out at this one hoodoo, and there's rock art around the hoodoo, all kinds of stuff. And the hoodoo is exactly where the south major standstill moon sets. No other features on the landscape whatsoever, except the moon setting with it in this room. So the room functions as the observatory, while the kiva does not. One last point. The other kivas that don't have any calendar whatsoever, we might be able to say that they didn't function so much as ceremonial kivas, but more as the habitation structures. I know that archaeologists talk a lot about, was a kiva actually ceremonial, or are we just kind of calling it a kiva, but it's really more like a pit house? All that. well, if there's no ceremony, if there's no astronomy, we might be able to say sometimes that it may be more on that end of the habitation end of the spectrum as opposed to the ceremonial end of the spectrum. So I think I'm just out of time. Perfect.